The morning sun, usually a gentle promise over the meticulously manicured lawns of Sterling Heights, felt like a harsh spotlight on the small, unassuming bungalow belonging to Arthur Vance. Arthur, a man of quiet habits and an almost preternatural calm, sat at his kitchen table, a chipped mug of lukewarm coffee in hand, watching through the pristine window as the first glimmers of an unjust dawn broke. He wasn't a man given to outbursts or public displays, his life a carefully constructed tapestry of ordered routines, yet around him, the air thrummed with a tension that would shatter most men. For months, the Sterling Heights Homeowners Association, or HOA, a self-appointed bastion of suburban tyranny, had relentlessly pursued him over what they termed unpaid dues, a ludicrous, inflated sum attached to a disputed landscape maintenance fee from 3 years prior, a fee Arthur had vehemently, and he believed, correctly, argued was not his responsibility under the obscure bylaws the HOA themselves seemed to interpret on a whim. Their letters, initially polite, had grown progressively menacing, each envelope thicker, its contents laced with thinly veiled threats of liens, legal action, and ultimately, foreclosure. Arthur had responded to each, meticulously, calmly, citing clauses, providing evidence, but it was like reasoning with a brick wall, a wall built of petty power and bureaucratic spite. He'd watched as neighbors, fearful of the HOA's omnipresent gaze and punitive fines, ostracize him, turning their backs as his once peaceful existence became a battleground of paper and threats. He'd seen the menacing certified mail stickers, the bold final notice stamped in angry red, the official-looking documents that, to any casual observer, painted him as a delinquent, a burden on the pristine utopia of Sterling Heights. Yet, through it all, Arthur remained composed, a stillness in his eyes that many mistook for defeat, but which, to a keen observer, might have hinted at something far more profound, something akin to anticipation. Today was the day the HOA had promised to act. A final, chilling letter had proclaimed the date and time, 9 a.m., sharp, for the official seizure of his property. The very idea was preposterous, yet the stern, humorless faces of the HOA board, particularly the perpetually scowling President Mildred Jenkins, and her sycophantic sidekick, Gerald Finch, echoed in his mind, their voices dripping with self-righteous indignation during the last confrontational meeting he'd been forced to attend. They reveled in their power, in the fear they instilled, and Arthur knew they were looking forward to making an example of him. He heard the distant thrum of engines, growing steadily louder, accompanied by the distinct, heavy crunch of tires on gravel as vehicles approached his driveway. A black SUV, sleek and official, pulled up first, followed by a local sheriff's department cruiser, its blue lights softly pulsating, though not flashing, a subtle show of authority. The sight of it would make most homeowners' blood run cold. Two uniformed officers exited the cruiser, their expressions stoic, while from the SUV emerged Mildred Jenkins, her face a mask of triumph, her lips thin and pressed, and Gerald Finch, clipboard in hand, a smarmy grin playing on his lips. They were flanked by two burly men in matching navy blazers, presumably their enforcement team, ready to carry out the physical eviction. Arthur watched them through the glass, his coffee now completely cold, his grip on the mug unwavering. He listened as Mildred's voice, shrill and self-important, cut through the morning air, addressing the officers, presenting documents. He heard the distinct click of his garden gate, then heavy footsteps on his porch. A firm knock resonated through the quiet house, then another, louder, more insistent. Arthur took a slow, deliberate sip of his cold coffee, setting the mug down, precisely in the center of a coaster. He rose, not with the hurried anxiety of a man facing ruin, but with the measured grace of someone merely moving from one room to another. He opened the door. Mildred Jenkins stood directly in front of him, her eyes narrowed with satisfaction. "Mr. Vance," she began, her voice dripping with artificial regret, "as per the final notice issued on May 15th, and following your continued failure to remit the outstanding dues, The Sterling Heights Homeowners Association is hereby exercising its right to seize this property for auction. She gestured grandly towards the officers and the two burly men. The sheriff's department is here to ensure a peaceful transition. Any attempt to obstruct will result in your immediate arrest. Gerald Finch, beside her, cleared his throat, holding up his clipboard like a sacred text. We have the legal documentation right here, Mr. Vance. It's all very clear. The two burly men took a step forward, their presence intimidating, ready to usher him out. One of the sheriff's deputies took a step closer, his hands subtly resting on his belt, his eyes assessing Arthur. For a beat, silence hung heavy, broken only by the chirping of birds in a nearby oak tree. Arthur looked at Mildred, then at Gerald, then at the officers, his gaze lingering on the glint of the sunlight off the sheriff's badge. A slow, almost imperceptible smile began to form at the corners of his lips, a smile that didn't reach his eyes, but seemed to emanate from a profound, knowing place deep within him. It was a smile of quiet amusement, a touch of a silent chuckle. He didn't flinch, didn't argue, didn't beg. Instead, he simply looked at Mildred Jenkins, his gaze piercing through her facade of authority, and with a voice that was perfectly calm, almost conversational, he said, "Oh, I assure you, Miss Jenkins, the only thing being seized today is a lesson, and it's not mine." With that enigmatic statement, Arthur Vance stepped calmly out of his bungalow, allowing the burly men to stride past him into his home, his eyes still holding that unsettling calm, that hint of a secret, as the door clicked shut behind him, sealing not his defeat, but the beginning of something entirely different. The click of the lock on his bungalow door was a symphony to Arthur Vance, not of loss, but of liberation. As Mildred Jenkins and her HOA cronies swarmed his now seized property like vultures on carrion, Arthur walked to his Mazda sedan, a vehicle chosen for its anonymity rather than its flash, and calmly drove away, leaving behind the charade he had so meticulously constructed. The smug satisfaction on Mildred's face was a fleeting image, quickly replaced by a deeper, more complex one, the memory of a handshake in a hushed boardroom, the rustle of papers signing away fortunes, and the cold, calculated precision of a plan years in the making. Arthur wasn't just a resident of Sterling Heights. He was, in fact, the secret, majority owner of Apex Holdings Corp., the colossal, labyrinthine conglomerate that owned the very management company which, in turn, managed the Sterling Heights HOA and hundreds of others across the nation. His seemingly ordinary life in the bungalow was a deliberate, strategic masquerade, a deeply embedded reconnaissance mission. The motivation for this elaborate, long-term deception wasn't mere spite, though a touch of that certainly seasoned the dish he was about to serve. It stemmed from a bitter, personal experience years ago, before Sterling Heights, when his aging parents had lost their lifelong home to a predatory HOA, driven out by a relentless campaign of manufactured fines and arbitrary rules. Their pleas, for reason met with bureaucratic stonewalls. That injustice had festered, transforming Arthur from a mild-mannered, highly successful, but private, tech entrepreneur into a strategist with a singular, quiet objective to dismantle such systems. From within, he had sold his burgeoning tech firm years prior, not for a lavish lifestyle, but for the liquid capital required for an undertaking of this magnitude. His journey began not with confrontation, but with infiltration. Arthur didn't just buy shares. He orchestrated a slow, methodical takeover of Apex Holdings. It started with anonymous shell corporations, registered in various offshore havens, each acquiring small, untraceable percentages of Apex stock. He leveraged a network of trusted, discreet financial advisors, each privy only to their isolated piece of the puzzle, never the full picture. He used complex derivatives, blind trusts, and a web of proxies, meticulously layering the ownership structure until Apex Holdings, on paper, appeared to be owned by a diverse portfolio of institutional investors, none of whom could trace back to a single individual. The process took over 7 years, an agonizing dance through corporate filings, quarterly reports, and a market fraught with volatility. During this time, he studied Apex's operations, its subsidiaries, its weak points, and crucially, its most aggressive and often unethical HOAs, like Sterling Heights. He saw how Mildred Jenkins and her ilk were empowered by Apex's lax oversight and profit-driven directives, turning community management into an instrument of petty tyranny. Arthur's bungalow in Sterling Heights wasn't just a home, it was his observation post, his ground zero. He had purchased it under a simple, easily traceable name, ensuring his identity as a resident was public, while his true power remained shrouded in corporate anonymity. The unpaid dues were a masterstroke of passive engagement, a controlled experiment to see how far the HOA would go, how ruthlessly they would pursue a seemingly helpless individual. He knew, down to the exact date, that they would seize his property. He had allowed it, even encouraged it, by feigning ignorance and escalating his polite, legally sound arguments, knowing that each step they took was a deeper plunge into the trap he had laid. Now, seated in a high-backed leather chair in a minimalist, secure office suite miles from Sterling Heights, an office even his closest acquaintances believed was merely a dormant investment property, Arthur turned to a wall-mounted screen. It displayed a complex organizational chart, a sprawling web of entities, with Apex Holdings Corp. At its pinnacle, and Sterling Heights HOA a tiny, insignificant speck near the bottom. His fingers, long and unblemished, moved with purpose across a sleek, obsidian keyboard. He accessed a secure portal, a gateway to the internal systems of Apex Holdings. There was no grand declaration, no public announcement. His counteroffensive would begin subtly, like a hairline crack in a dam. His first move was simple, almost benign to an outsider. He initiated an internal audit review for all HOA management companies under Apex Holdings, specifically flagging discrepancies in maintenance fee collections and legal enforcement procedures within the Northeast region. He ensured the audit team assigned was new, ambitious, and unconnected to the entrenched old guard. Simultaneously, he discreetly adjusted the budget allocations for legal defense funds for troublesome HOAs, tightening the purse strings just enough to make their aggressive litigation tactics slightly more expensive, slightly less automatic. He then scheduled an anonymous, internal ethics seminar for all HOA board members within Apex's portfolio, with particular emphasis on fair practices and resident dispute resolution, a seminar that, while seemingly innocuous, carried the weight of a direct, though hidden, corporate mandate. He leaned back, his eyes fixed on the screen, a ghost of that unsettling calm returning to his face. The bait was taken. The game had truly begun. Mildred and her ilk were about to find out that when you steal from the unsuspecting, you must be very, very sure that the unsuspecting aren't watching you from the very top. The days following the seizure of Arthur Vance's bungalow became a slow, agonizing unraveling for the Sterling Heights HOA. From his discreet, off-site observation post, Arthur watched, a phantom puppeteer pulling invisible strings. His initial moves, the internal audit review and the subtle budget tweaks, were designed not for immediate collapse, but for insidious disruption. The first tremors were barely noticeable, dismissed by the HOA board as administrative hiccups. Mildred Jenkins, perpetually preening in her self-appointed authority, initially scoffed when Gerald Finch reported a sudden, unannounced audit request from Apex Holdings. More corporate busywork, she'd huffed, waving a dismissive hand. Just comply, Gerald, it'll blow over. But it didn't blow over. The audit team, new faces, sharp eyes, and utterly unswayed by Mildred's bluster, dug deep, far deeper than any previous audit. They scrutinized every invoice, every expenditure, every obscure bylaw interpretation, particularly those related to disputed maintenance fees. Internal memos, usually rubber-stamped, were now being flagged. Minor accounting inconsistencies, previously overlooked, were highlighted with stern recommendations for immediate rectification. The time the board spent managing community affairs rapidly dwindled, replaced by endless meetings with auditors, deciphering complex spreadsheets, and justifying years of questionable decisions. As the audit tightened its grip, other cracks began to appear. The slight reduction in the legal defense funds from Apex, a mere percentage point, began to sting. Sterling Heights, known for its aggressive legal posture against residents, suddenly found its usual legal firm, Patel and Associates, becoming less enthusiastic, more hesitant. Their fees, once easily covered by the generous Apex umbrella, now required more stringent internal investigation from the HOA board. A lawsuit against a new resident over a minor fence height violation, a case Mildred was convinced they'd win effortlessly, dragged on unexpectedly, consuming valuable resources and time. The lawyer from Patel and Associates even hinted, somewhat cryptically, about new directives from Apex regarding litigation strategy, leaving Mildred fuming with confusion. Directives: we dictate our legal strategy. This is our community, she'd railed in a heated board meeting, slamming her fist on the polished mahogany table, but the subtle pressure continued. Then came the mysterious internal dissent. A long-standing, seemingly loyal HOA committee member, Mrs. Gable, a woman known for her unwavering support of Mildred, suddenly resigned, citing unforeseen ethical conflicts with current HOA practices. Her resignation letter, though polite, was oddly formal, almost legalistic in its phrasing, and hinted at internal pressures. It sparked whispers and distrust among the remaining board members. Who was putting pressure on Mrs. Gable? Was it someone from within? Paranoia began to seep into their perfectly manicured lives. Arthur, maintaining his carefully crafted facade, attended the next public HOA meeting. He sat in the back row, blending with a handful of curious residents who dared to show their faces, a neutral observer among the bewildered. From his vantage point, he watched Mildred Jenkins's usually confident posture begin to sag. Her eyes darted nervously, her answers to resident questions were clipped, defensive. Gerald Finch, typically smug, fidgeted constantly, his face pale, his clipboard now a shield rather than a prop of authority. They were visibly flustered as residents, emboldened by the HOA's apparent disarray, began to voice complaints about delayed landscaping, unaddressed maintenance issues, and the inexplicable increase in their quarterly assessments, expenses that, unbeknownst to them, were now disproportionately shouldering the unbudgeted audit and legal fees. Arthur, his presence unnoticed, felt a quiet satisfaction. He subtly noted the subtle glances the board members exchanged, the furtive whispers, the way their usual united front was fracturing under the invisible weight he applied. The final, significant blow came like a well-aimed punch. Under the guise of a standardized technological upgrade across all managed properties, Apex Holdings mandated a complete overhaul of the HOA's ancient, bespoke accounting software system. This wasn't merely an upgrade, it was a forced migration to a new, proprietary Apex system that required extensive retraining, exposed all previous data to Apex's direct oversight, and, crucially, automatically flagged irregular transactions or unusual enforcement proceedings. The HOA's current system, a convoluted mess of spreadsheets and outdated databases that had allowed them to obscure their questionable accounting practices, was to be decommissioned within weeks. Mildred, Gerald, and the rest of the board erupted. This wasn't a suggestion. It was an order from the parent company they barely acknowledged existed. Their frantic calls to Apex were met with polite but unyielding corporate speak. The new system was non-negotiable. It meant their entire, deliberately opaque financial history would be laid bare to Apex's new, scrupulous auditing protocols. The prospect of their dubious unpaid dues collection methods, or the inflated legal costs being visible to their ultimate corporate overseers, filled them with terror. The mandate effectively cut off their ability to operate in the shadows, choking their financial leverage and exposing their every questionable dealing. The HOA board, stripped of their power and facing an insurmountable technological wall, was left desperate for answers, their carefully constructed kingdom beginning to visibly, audibly, and irrevocably crumble. The digital overhaul mandated by Apex Holdings, combined with the relentless audit, plunged the Sterling Heights HOA into utter chaos, but it also ignited a desperate, furious hunt for the unseen hand behind their misery. Mildred Jenkins, her face now a roadmap of stress lines, and Gerald Finch, perpetually on the verge of a nervous breakdown, escalated their frantic calls to Apex Holdings. They demanded explanations, scapegoats, anything to staunch the bleeding of their authority and finances. Apex, itself now subtly manipulated by Arthur, responded by dispatching not comfort, but a seasoned corporate troubleshooter, Eleanor Vance, no relation to Arthur Vance, at least not that anyone knew. Eleanor was a formidable, sharp-witted woman, with a reputation for untangling complex corporate knots and identifying hidden adversaries. Her arrival sent a chill through the HOA board, who initially saw her as a corporate enforcer. Little did they know, she was tasked with identifying the actual source of the internal turmoil, the discrepancies that pointed to a systemic attack rather than mere mismanagement. Eleanor, unlike the previous auditors, wasn't just looking at numbers. She was looking for a pattern, a motive, and a mastermind. Eleanor's investigation was swift and incisive. She quickly dismissed Mildred and Gerald's petty grievances, focusing instead on the unprecedented audit deep dives, the sudden shifts in legal strategy, and the highly unusual software migration mandate that had crippled the HOA. Her sharp intellect led her to suspect a deliberate, targeted operation. She started cross-referencing data points, not just within Sterling Heights, but across other Apex-managed HOAs that had experienced similar, albeit smaller, glitches. Her analysis began to paint a picture of a single, sophisticated entity orchestrating a campaign of disruption. This led to Arthur's first genuine near-miss. Eleanor's team traced the anonymous instructions for the software overhaul and the specific audit parameters back to a series of encrypted server clusters, while the immediate IP addresses bounced through several untraceable offshore proxies. Eleanor's forensic specialists managed to identify a peculiar digital fingerprint, a unique coding signature, embedded within the command strings. This signature had been used only once before, years ago, in the sale of a relatively small, but highly innovative, tech startup that had disappeared from the public eye. The company, Chronos Innovations, founded and privately sold by Arthur Vance. The connection was tenuous, circumstantial at best, but it was a lead Eleanor couldn't ignore. Her team began quietly running background checks on Arthur Vance, the recently evicted resident of Sterling Heights, searching for any link, any anomaly in his public persona. Meanwhile, Arthur, observing Eleanor's methodical progress through Apex's internal surveillance systems, a perk of his ownership, felt a prickle of genuine concern. Eleanor Vance was good, far better than he'd anticipated. He watched as her inquiries circled closer, like a hawk spotting prey. When her team's background check request on his public identity popped up on his internal monitors, a calculated smile touched his lips. He knew exactly what she'd find: a meticulously unremarkable past, a few faded photos from an old tech magazine article, a perfectly clean slate. But he also knew she'd be looking for something more. He had to subtly throw her off. Arthur initiated a controlled digital smoke screen. He deployed a series of automated, untraceable phishing attempts targeting a few low-level Apex employees with suspicious, easily identifiable links, creating a false trail of external threats that mimicked his own digital fingerprint. These threats were just sophisticated enough to capture Eleanor's attention, diverting her forensic efforts away from the subtle Chronos Innovations lead and towards what appeared to be an escalating wave of cyber espionage. It bought him precious time, but he knew it was a temporary reprieve. Eleanor, presented with this new, seemingly more urgent threat, shifted her primary focus, but a lingering suspicion about Arthur Vance remained. She continued to dig into his past, albeit on a secondary track. This led to the second, even closer call. Eleanor's team uncovered a dormant, obscure LLC limited shared liability company that Arthur had briefly owned years ago, purely as a contingency for an unrelated, abandoned project. This LLC, Aegis Solutions, had, for a fleeting 2 months, shared a virtual private server VPS with a different, far larger LLC that Apex Holdings had used as a shell during a complex acquisition 6 years prior. It was an infinitesimal overlap in a sea of data, a digital ghost, but it showed a near invisible, historical proximity between Arthur and Apex that sent a jolt through Eleanor. It wasn't direct proof, but it was a significant coincidence. Eleanor began to suspect that Arthur Vance wasn't just a wrong resident. He was a player. She escalated her discreet inquiries, trying to link Arthur's public life to the high-level financial movements that Apex Holdings' ultimate ownership entailed. She even paid a subtle, unannounced visit to the now-vacant bungalow in Sterling Heights, examining the property for any overlooked clues, sensing an intelligence behind the quiet exterior. Arthur watched her movements, a silent admiration for her tenacity growing even as the pressure mounted. He saw her walk around his former property, a slight frown on her face, a glint of determination in her eyes. The proximity of her investigation, the accuracy of her hunches, meant his window for the grand reveal was closing rapidly. He couldn't afford to be discovered as the architect before his carefully planned denouement. He had used his resources to create diversions, to obfuscate, but the web of corporate ownership was vast and complex, and Eleanor was getting closer to pulling the right threads. The time for subtlety was over. It was time for the final act. From his secure office, Arthur executed a series of irrevocable commands. He meticulously prepared a comprehensive dossier, a digital and physical compendium of every detail of his ownership, Apex Holdings' history, the HOA's transgressions, and the undeniable proof of his meticulously planned takeover. He also prepared a public statement, carefully worded to expose the truth with maximum impact. He set up the secure servers, double-checked the broadcast links, and ensured all legal paperwork was primed for immediate filing. The game of cat and mouse was reaching its crescendo. The stage was set, the audience unknowingly assembled. Arthur Vance, the quiet man, the wronged resident, was ready to step out of the shadows and claim his rightful place at the very top, prepared to shock not just Mildred Jenkins, but the entire corporate structure that had enabled her. The hastily called emergency board meeting of the Sterling Heights HOA was a cauldron of anxiety. Mildred Jenkins paced frantically, her usual imperiousness replaced by palpable fear. Gerald Finch, practically a shadow of his former self, clutched a crumpled tissue, muttering about lawsuits and corporate malfeasance. Eleanor Vance, the corporate troubleshooter, sat at the head of the table, her expression unreadable, a stack of meticulously organized binders before her. The atmosphere was thick with dread, a silent acknowledgement that their carefully constructed world was crumbling. The few other board members present looked equally terrified, their petty power struggles forgotten in the face of an existential threat. The large conference room, usually reserved for mundane discussions about shrubbery and swimming pool hours, now felt like a courtroom. The doors swung open, and two figures entered. First, a stern-faced legal representative from Apex Holdings, Mr. Davies, whom the HOA board recognized from previous, less pleasant encounters. But it was the second figure who caused a collective gasp to ripple through the room, stopping Mildred dead in her tracks. Arthur Vance walked in, not the unassuming, slightly disheveled man they had evicted, but composed, impeccably dressed, his eyes holding that familiar, unsettling calm, now sharpened with an undeniable authority. He didn't sit with the residents in the back. He walked directly to the empty chair at the table, across from Mildred, and sat down. Mildred's voice, usually booming, came out as a strangled whisper. You, what are you doing here? You're no longer a resident. This is a private meeting. Arthur merely smiled, a genuine, if chilling, smile. On the contrary, Miss Jenkins, he said, his voice resonant, cutting through the tension. This meeting is very much my business, and as for being a resident well, that was merely a temporary living arrangement. Eleanor Vance, observing the scene, fixed her gaze on Arthur, a flicker of recognition, then dawning understanding, in her eyes. Her internal investigation had led her to him, but this brazen appearance was beyond anything she'd anticipated. She watched, fascinated, as Arthur produced a sleek tablet from his briefcase, a single tap illuminating the large projector screen at the front of the room. The first image that appeared was the familiar logo of Apex Holdings Corp., but below it, in bold, undeniable letters, were the words, Controlling Shareholder, Arthur Vance. A stunned silence fell. Gerald Finch's tissue dropped to the floor. Mildred's jaw went slack, her eyes wide with a horrifying realization. That's impossible, she stammered, pointing a trembling finger at the screen. You're just a resident. You owe us money. Arthur chuckled, a low, humorless sound. Oh, Ms. Jenkins, you have no idea how much money I truly owe you. Or, rather, how much you owe me, he gestured to the screen. For the past 7 years, through a series of meticulously structured blind trusts and holding companies, I have been the majority shareholder of Apex Holdings Corp. I own Apex, and Apex, as you know, owns the management company that oversees Sterling Heights HOA. He paused, letting the words sink in, the full weight of the revelation crushing the board members. Meaning, in essence, I own you, he continued, his voice calm, yet laced with a controlled power. My motivation was simple. Years ago, my parents, good, honest people, lost their home to an HOA similar to yours, driven out by the very same predatory tactics, manufactured fines, relentless harassment over minor infractions, and an unyielding bureaucracy designed to bleed residents dry. Apex Holdings, as I discovered, was a significant enabler of such practices. I decided then that if I wanted to dismantle such a corrupt system, I couldn't fight it from the outside. I had to become the system. He then detailed his plan, the screens changing to display complex corporate structures, financial transfers, and timelines. I allowed you to seize my property because it was the final, undeniable proof of your egregious overreach. It was the perfect trigger for the complete corporate overhaul I had planned. Your aggression, your arrogance, your disregard for due process, it was all being carefully documented, meticulously observed. Every unpaid due, every threat, every legal notice, every act of intimidation. It built my case. Mr. Davies, the legal representative, stepped forward, clearing his throat. Ms. Jenkins, Mr. Finch, as of this moment, per directives from Mr. Vance, the newly appointed CEO of Apex Holdings, your services to the Sterling Heights HOA, and indeed to any entity under Apex management, are terminated immediately. Furthermore, a comprehensive internal investigation has uncovered substantial evidence of financial mismanagement, excessive litigation costs, and unethical collection practices under your leadership. Apex Holdings will be pursuing full legal recourse to recoup all damages. The words hit Mildred like a physical blow. Her face drained of color, her eyes darting wildly. Gerald Finch whimpered, clutching his chest. The other board members looked like deer caught in headlights, their faces contorted with fear. Arthur concluded, his gaze firm. The Sterling Heights HOA, as you know it, will be dissolved. A new, transparent, and resident-focused community association will be established, governed by truly representative bylaws, with a clear code of ethics. All illegally collected fees will be refunded. All outstanding liens based on frivolous charges will be dropped. And those who have suffered under your regime will receive full restitution. He looked at Eleanor Vance. Eleanor, you will oversee the transition. Your thoroughness in almost discovering me proves you are the right person for the job. Eleanor nodded, a rare, small smile gracing her lips. As Mildred Jenkins and Gerald Finch were escorted out by the legal team, their protests dying in their throats, the conference room felt suddenly lighter. The oppressive weight of their tyranny lifted. Arthur Vance stood up, looking at the stunned remaining board members. He hadn't sought revenge for revenge's sake, but for justice. He had dismantled a predatory system from within, turning its own mechanisms against it. His property might have been seized, but he had, in return, claimed the entire kingdom. The man who had seemingly lost everything had, in fact, gained the power to rewrite the rules, ensuring that no one else would suffer the same fate as his parents. The quiet man was quiet no more. His silence had merely been the prelude to a symphony of reckoning.